Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. One of the most famous revelations of Joseph Smith is known as the Civil War prophecy, where he prophesied that the Civil War would start in South Carolina. It turned out that it's exactly what happened some 30 years later. We're going to talk about how the Civil War affected apocalyptic thought among Latter-day Saints. Check out our conversation. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these other periods, specifically the martyrdom of Joseph Smith, because that was such a shock to the early saints. And so they now had to reinterpret that in light of Joseph's death. Can you talk about how apocalypticism changed in Latter-day Saint thought because of the martyrdom?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I think is so interesting is that Latter-day Saints really emphasized a particular passage of the book of Revelation. If you remember the book of Revelation, there's this throne room vision and there's this book, and this book has 7 seals on it. And Latter-day Saints say these 7 seals represent time periods of the earth. But it seems like people have different opinions of that. But there's certainly major events occurring on earth, right? And as these seals are opened, you see the 4 horsemen are the first ones. Death and famine and war are being put out in these scenes. And then another seal is open and they see martyrs under the altar, the sort of heavenly altar. And the martyrs are praying, and they're praying for vengeance. And they say, God, when will you avenge us? And the response is, be patient, wait until the rest of your brethren, the martyrs, have been killed. And so Latter-day Saints saw this scene and they said, well, one of the last days things is we're waiting for these martyrs to happen. Eliza R. Snow writes a poet that says, we're these martyrs. Like, we can expect persecution because this is happening. When the saints first get to Nauvoo, Joseph's in Liberty Jail, and the apostles write to the saints and say, we know we're going to be persecuted, guys. We don't have to. This is part of the plan. And eventually, your murderers will be brought to justice. So there's this expectation that the saints have to be martyred, that there should be widespread persecution, and it's part of bringing to pass the second coming. Joseph's death, one of the key things here is it changes all that. Allegedly, one story is that Joseph, right before he goes to Liberty Jail, sends out a message for the saints to read that specific chapter about these martyrs as he's on his way there. That he wants them to be very aware of this idea of a last martyr. And after his death, this is something that Sam Brown points out, Joseph is recognized in this role as last martyr. Now all these events can happen. Brigham Young will give a discourse to say, you don't understand what's happened here with Joseph's death, but because Joseph has died, there will be much less blood demanded of us. This sort of message to say, we once expected vast martyrdom, but Joseph's actually been sort of a savior to us physically, because the nation can be sated by taking his life. They're not going to come after us in the same way. Now, that doesn't mean we don't want to leave town, but it's not demanded in the same way to fulfill these events. So when I discovered that, I thought, this is incredible. What a sort of interesting idea of how martyrology plays here. Now, at the same time, that idea doesn't stick around too long. It's not a one that's going to continue. Obviously, 1857, those ideas pick up again with the Utah War and Parley P. Pratt's martyrdom and other things. But Joseph's martyrdom becomes this major event that now is going to bring judgment on the United States itself. So Brigham will emphasize, it's sort of an idea that if the United States hadn't, these politicians hadn't directly conspired to kill Joseph Smith, if they didn't do that, they at least were complicit in it, or they're happy that it happened. And so as a result, the judgment's going to pour out on Illinois and America. And so the flight from leaving Illinois into the desert or into the Rocky Mountains is not just to get rid of your persecutors, it's to escape a nation that God's going to judge. So you need to get out of there.
Well, a couple directions I want to go there. And I know this wasn't in your book, but I think it's really interesting when we look at the LDS Church's view that martyrdom is to be expected, trials are to be expected. But it's also interesting, in that same time period, you have the community of, well, I guess I should call it the RLDS Church, because they weren't the community of Christ back then. The RLDS Church that's saying, well, look, the reason why they're suffering so bad is because God's putting his punishments on them. As well as William Bickerton. Basically the same thing, where it's funny that inside the church, we look at it as, oh, we're martyrs. And outside the church, they're looking at it, no, God's punishing you.
Oh, isn't that fascinating? Yeah, the one thing I do mention with that is Strang's curse, right? Strang writes this curse on the saints in Nauvoo, predicting that, they're going to get these same diseases and things that the saints believe are being put on Joseph's persecutors and others, the idea of a curse. And so Strang in 1845 is the first one to kind of turn that on his fellow Latter-day Saints and how this is going to happen. You guys are in trouble. So absolutely.
It's interesting to see how people interpret the same events. So.
And I think, one thing I didn't write about here is for several of these small groups, Brigham Young becomes the Antichrist figure. Right? He's the one that's taken over the temple and done these evil things to lead astray the church. So forget the United States government. They're not even part of it. They're looking at the tyrant of Brigham rather than,
Yeah. Well, interesting. And so then I think the next part and you kind of alluded to it a little bit with the Utah War, but of course right after the Utah War was the Civil War. Yeah. And so that brings up a whole lot of other, and especially the Civil War. I really enjoyed what you talked about there, especially with the prophecy about the Civil War and how parts of it were fulfilled and parts of it weren't fulfilled. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Civil War prophecy is perhaps one of the most important revelations Joseph Smith has. It happens, he's recording this in 1832. Joseph, in 1832, maybe 1833, he gets nervous about spreading apocalyptic prophecies, particularly, the Book of Mormon's all about what Jared Hickman calls Amerindian apocalypse, right? The idea that this fallen people are going to be restored, and part of their restoration is they're going to attack the Gentiles and wipe out the nation. The nation's going to suffer from these Native American uprisings. And Joseph says, I want you guys to stop talking about it. We have this great letter where he says, this is all true, but this is just going to make us enemies if we talk too much about the curses on the nation sort of thing. And I think that plays into a really important decision. He wrote this amazing prophecy, and then they decide not to publish it. Doesn't show up in the Book of Commandments, doesn't show up in the 1835 or 1843 or 44 or 45 Doctrine and Covenants. It's going to wait all the way to be published until 1852 in the Pearl of Great Price. So here's a revelation that Joseph and others had. It's maintained in our records, but it's not published to anyone. Civil War prophecy. Joseph will still talk about it at various times. A few people will have copies of it. Orson Pratt and Orson Hyde talk about copyings, but not published and distributed until 1852. And of course, that prophecy says there's going to be North versus South fight that's going to start in South Carolina. The remnant, which in the language of the time is Native American peoples, are going to rise up. Slaves will rise up against their masters. There's some major racial dimensions as well as regional dimensions to this sort of civil war. And eventually, Britain and other nations will get absorbed into this war, and eventually it's going to fill the world until all nations are no more. So it can't all be fulfilled, right? We have this, nations are no more. And there's a variety of other, the last couple of verses of this section 87 are kind of like, and there's going to be floods and destructions and all the other stuff you can imagine are going to happen too. Nations will be no more. And so they can't all be fulfilled. That said, 1852, Latter-day Saints publish this, and they get really excited as tensions, fester between North and South later in the 1850s. Latter-day Saints are right there, pointing at these things. By the time 1860 rolls around, people are writing Brigham Young with missionaries excited that they were able to get it published in different newspapers. So Latter-day Saints are flaunting this revelation everywhere they can go. There's been a non-historical criticism of this prophecy that says, oh, it was never a big deal until after the Civil War, because it wasn't added to the Doctrine and Covenants until 1876. But once you understand this full picture, Latter-day Saints hold it back, and then in the 1850s really just throw it in. This is used, Orson Pratt. We stopped doing missionary work in the nation for about a decade after Joseph Smith's death, and many people believe this is the end of missionary work to America, that they've had their chance, the nation's done. But around the time that Brigham Young announces polygamy, missionary work again opens up there. Orson Pratt is sent to Washington, D.C., and he starts a newspaper called The Seer, and this is the second place the prophecies published. And his major use of that is to say, guys, we meant it. Like, God is really going to judge the nation, so you need to get to the Rocky Mountains. We're gathering for a reason. You need to get over here. And so I think it plays a major role just among the saints to get stragglers and new converts to get to Utah. It's fascinating. Of course, this is a major prophecy that Latter-day Saints are going to hold on to the whole way. Now, yeah, you mentioned that it didn't all happen the way they expected.
Right.
Certainly, Great Britain intercedes on the side of the South, right? So people can kind of point to that. But it doesn't seem like all the nations are part of this war.
Right, yeah.
So how do you explain that? And so, we're going to have thinkers like James Talmage and B.H. Roberts return to this prophecy in the early 1900s with World War I and say, look, now these parts are fitting into place. Other people are playing with it in different ways. The big point from Brigham Young is, I think it's Brigham Young, maybe T.B. Kimball says, look, it's not over yet. It seems like the division in the United States is at an end, but it's not. You can expect for that Civil War to pick up one more time.
Maybe this year, right?
Yeah, maybe this year. Lots of people wanted to insert the idea of a second Civil War starting in Chicago. This is a late 1900s idea, but became a particularly important nowadays as people pull to this one source in the 1900s. But just part of that bigger thing to say, Civil War ended, but it's going to come back. Don't worry. And of course, one of the things I just thought was so interesting as I researched this is that this isn't just a Latter-day Saint conversation. Like, the anti-Mormon press is also picking up on this and arguing, right? Like, well, it does seem like you guys got this part right, but you didn't get this part right.
Exactly.
And wait a second, this looks right, but come on. And so I love great comment from Gunnison about this sort of, Gunnison, military guy, lives in Utah in the 1850s and writes about his experience with Latter-day Saints. And he writes his book that says, let's just hold off. If in a few years angels lead the Latter-day Saints back across the plains to Jackson County, then we can trust all these other things.
Well, yeah, because I thought that was interesting because it did seem like there were kind of ebbs and flows where there's a lot of apocalyptic thought. It was interesting to see how you talked about how lay members would sometimes publish the visions and the church would encourage them, and other times they would discourage them. Even Brigham Young would kind of discourage some of this apocalyptic thought.
Yes.
And I think because you mentioned something about a church needs moderation in these sort of things.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. The point about Joseph Smith, that he's even moderating some of these ideas. Usually not. Usually inviting people to have their own views, and certainly, based on his ideas, sort of speculation or sharing dreams, all things Joseph allows. Brigham Young also allows for those sorts of visions broadly if they're aimed at America or so on. They're gonna have this bad thing happen here. Well, nobody's preventing those prophecies. But one prophecy that Brigham Young is very concerned about was a prophecy about how near the return to Jackson County would be. So W.W. Phelps, and particularly this idea of a prophet like unto Moses who would lead them back there. Joseph's language in section 58, I think it's 58, maybe it's 103, talks about a prophet like unto Moses who will lead the people back to Jackson County.
One mighty and strong.
Yeah, and later on the one mighty and strong in section 85, these sort of key figures that are going to come. And the saints have to wonder, who are these guys? Are they the current prophet? Does that mean Rick Bennett could be the guy? All of a sudden, God tells you to do it and forget who's the leader of the church. Now you're the guy.
Some fundamentalists like to think that.
Right, absolutely. And people have the whole history of Latter-day Saints have sort of showed up for these messianic prophesied figures. Somebody's going to translate the sealed Book of Mormon. Well, it's not Thomas S. Monson, it's me. It's not Russell M. Nelson, it's this guy. So these messianic prophecies were dangerous because it did suggest to some people that maybe leadership could appear outside of just the basic succession. W.W. Phelps is a fascinating figure. He said that Brigham Young was the man who would lead the saints back to Jackson County, the one like unto Moses. And Brigham got very upset with W.W. Phelps. He calls him to a meeting and says, why would you think it's your place to publicly say I'm the one like Moses? W. Phelps said, I assumed it was Joseph before he died, so it's
Must
you.
Be you. Yeah.
And Brigham Young says, well, why can't it be the guy after me or the guy after him? And W. Phelps says, I think it's nearer than that. And Brigham Young says in this private meeting, we're building the Salt Lake Temple. I don't think it's ever going to get built until we get back to Jackson County and build that temple first. And I think we're going to be back there in 7 years. But I would never tell the saints that, because the second I tell them that, they're going to stop doing their work here. We're not going to build a temple. We're not going to build walls around our cities. We're just going to become focused on this idea. And so, yeah, I think that you're right. That key about moderation, how much apocalyptic should we encourage, is a major question for leaders then and I think now.
Yeah. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Christopher Blythe. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about how world wars affected LDS apocalyptic thought.
And now 1945 shows up, and all American apocalypse turns towards this idea of fire, right? Now we understand how the globe could be burned, and so the atomic bomb becomes a major emphasis, not only in evangelical prophecy literature, but in our own. Thanks for listening to Gospel Tangents. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents, and for just $5 a month, you can hear the entire interview without interruptions. Also, we've also got transcripts available, like these here, that are available on Patreon as well as on our website. So to get those, just for $10 a month, you can subscribe and hit the yellow subscribe button. We've also got paperbacks like these. If you want to get those, you can get those at Amazon.com and just do a search for Gospel Tangents Interview, and you can get the paperback versions. Or we've also got subscriptions on those as well. And if you subscribe on our website, I'll send those to you as soon as they're finished automatically. Don't forget to get our latest updates at facebook.com/gospeltangents. And don't forget to tweet at us at Gospel Tangents. Of course, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. And please give us a 5-star rating for those of you who listen to the audio only. And of course, you should show your support for Gospel Tangents with one of these cool t-shirts, like this green one, or light blue, sport gray, royal blue, purple, of course black, beautiful gold, and of course Utah red. I've probably left out some colors, but if you want to see more, go to gospeltangents.com/shop and you can get one of these. So by the way, if you get one of these by Christmas and show your support for Gospel Tangents, I'll even send you a copy of a PDF transcript of your choice, anyone. So just make your order hopefully by December 1st so you can get it in time for Christmas. And but I'll even keep it open through the end of the year.
So just sign up, get a t-shirt at gospeltangents.com/shop, any color that you like, and I will send you a free PDF if you do it before the end of the year. So once again, thanks for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again.